Baroness Primarolo, I have just a handful of further questions to ask you. The first is this. Do you consider that civil service officials were thwarting your attempts to provide a robust, positive response to Lord Archer's recommendations?
No, I don't think that they had a strategy or were deliberately thwarting my objectives. I think they had decided what had happened and they were holding the line, which led to a disagreement between me and them. But I don't feel, and had I felt that there was a cover-up or prevented from access to information, then I would have acted accordingly. And I think you can see that in the evidence I've put in, that when there was an incident with Patience Wilson, I did pursue it very hard.
Did you consider that the Secretary of State, Mr. Johnson, was supportive of what you were trying to achieve?
Yes, I do. I think the Secretary of State did take the view that we should try and find a way forward, even if we couldn't deliver everything at that point. So yes, he didn't block my attempts at all.
Are you aware of any occasions when a minister has asked to and been permitted to speak to those from a previous administration?
Am I aware of any?
Are you aware of any?
I'm not, and I don't think it's ever happened, ever.
And then I want to go back to an issue I was exploring with you shortly before lunch, and that was the question of listening to what patients said they thought had gone wrong. And this isn't asking you about what the department had or hadn't done in terms of gathering information. So this is a general, in principle question. Do you agree that in principle, the department couldn't properly conclude that there'd been no wrongdoing in respect of NHS patients without listening to what the patients thought had gone wrong?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes. So do you agree that the Department of Health couldn't properly reach the decision that there'd been no wrongdoing, no wrongful practices in relation to NHS patients unless they had first listened to what patients said they thought had happened?
That's a really difficult question to answer given the structure of the NHS. Should the NHS, in the treatment it's given, be sure that it is listening to patients and responding to them? The answer is yes. Should that information be clear all the way up to the Department of Health? I think the answer to that is yes. Do I know whether that happened or not with regard to the infected and affected? The answer is I don't know. I don't know it didn't, but I don't know whether it did.
And then shortly before we break, we looked at that phrase in your witness statement about institutional inertia. Do you have any thoughts on how that could be combated?
As a general principle, as opposed to this example, which is highly complex, it requires actually a minister to assert their view. And I was reflecting over lunch had you seen documents and exchanges between myself and HMRC officials, you would have seen me disagreeing with them. It's the job of ministers to take policy decisions and to try and deliver those in the round when taking advice. So I think that is something that all ministers should be aware of, that they aren't, that they need to pursue what their policy objective is. I can't think of another way to deal with that, and that's how I tried to deal with it when I was a Minister of Health, but equally when I was a Treasury Minister or afterwards in education. You have to assert yourself, but you must listen to all the information that is given to you, which is given in good faith and taken in good faith.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from those suggested by call participants. Mr. Moss has nothing. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. The first is this, really. It's about yourself. You came into the job as a Minister of Health without there being any particular scientific knowledge or without having any particular involvement in health before, except as a constituency MP. You've described to us how at the end of your roughly 2-year stint, you've got a lot more information than you had when you started. Plainly, that had come to you rather gradually over the period, had it?
Yes, Sir Brian, yes.
And when you began, it would appear, but I may have got this wrong, but it would appear that you happily, or at least were content to, adopt the line which you were briefed about by officials who'd been at the department for longer than you had. And at the end, you were beginning to question some of the lines that they were giving to you. Is that right?
That's correct, Sir Brian. Could I just say, obviously the Archer report had also been published by them, yes.
And you'd read that, and that caused you to have a number of questions.
I can't be absolutely sure, Sir Brian, of the time frame because I was beginning to ask questions in more detail. The regularity of the subject around the question of the public inquiry came back to me, and each time I would reflect and consider what I needed to know. So there was a combination, I think, of seeing more information gradually, being able to ask more questions and get answers, and to try and build a picture for myself in terms of what was the evidence being presented to me.
So that picture was a picture which grew with time while you were in the department.
I think that would be the case, Sir Brian. Yes, and when I look at the documentation to remind me, because I'm relying very heavily on that I can almost see that myself as I'm pushing back and pushing back. That's my natural disposition to ask questions. And you're quite right. At the beginning, it was a huge brief. I was dealing with, forgive me, I'm not using this as an excuse, a huge amount of information, highly complex. The role of a minister is around the dimensions of policy and delivering that policy, and therefore getting the information necessary. And if 10 years in the Treasury, I was, well, I was going to say I was much better at the end than I was at the beginning, but perhaps that's a judgment for other people, not me. But it makes my point, yes.
So the expression personal journey may be rather too grand for it, but in a sense what you've described is a personal journey so far as your knowledge and interest in this particular area is concerned, is it?
Yes, I think so. I was always of the view that the right thing, the just, I can't quite find words to describe it. The right thing needs to be done for the infected and affected. And there are other examples of different episodes entirely separate from this in the health service or in government. So I'm trying to get information. I'm trying to make a decision on the facts as they are presented to me, and across the board of all the decisions I make, balancing how to progress. And it is challenging, but that is the job of ministers of state, any minister within a ministerial team, reporting back to the Secretary of State.
Now, a number of ministers who've passed through Aldwych House have described how they felt, perhaps, that having 2 years in a post or shorter might not give enough time for a minister to be really effective in delivering change, if that's what they thought was appropriate. There's obviously a tension between spending too long in a post, spending too little time. But had the period gone on beyond the 2 years in your case, you no doubt have continued asking more questions, getting more information, and continuing your journey, as I've labelled it. Do you think there's any way in which that process of gathering information, having a journey of discovery for yourself, developing your own picture of what had happened, how that could be accelerated in the general case?
That's quite a big question,
Sir
Brian. I'm going to do my best to try and answer it. I was 10 years a Treasury Minister, and it is absolutely true that you need to go through a couple of cycles with, for example, the finance bill, before you're familiar yourself, as well as the information you're getting from your civil servants. So I think the point about how long ministers are in post is something that could be reflected on. But I recall that in 1997, when we were appointed as ministers and I went to the Treasury, waiting for me was a very large number of ring files. Apparently they do one for every political party, depending on who's elected. You're not allowed to see what they did for the other parties, which might help. But, and it would give you basically an update on where everything was, but most importantly, what might be the flashpoints. And then it looks at policies. So, should each department, for an incoming minister, give them a quick resume of the live issues as they see it in the department, I think is a moot point. Would it help the minister? But the Whitehall analogy really is, it's a sort of, well, if the minister doesn't succeed, you won't be a minister very long.
Well, leave aside the change of administration from one political persuasion to another. But within the same administration, there is quite often a reshuffle, as we know. And reshuffle is between members who are, at least on paper, in the same political persuasion. Would there be anything to stop a short period of handover? Does it have to be instant, that a minister comes in without having any briefing, apart from what the civil servants may be asked to give them about issues which they may not know are live? Might it be an idea to have a handover of a sort? It would happen in most ordinary employments.
It would indeed happen in most ordinary employment. The idea of the civil service is to give continuity, and that they are providing that as the ministers come and go. That probably works well in most cases. In this case, there are question marks, which is a matter for you. Whether it would have helped as a new minister even to have been given a summary, which I don't recall I had, of the main issues that were on the outgoing minister's desk, I think that is worthy of consideration, yes, because you're already going to be reading lots of stuff. Would that then, otherwise you could be in danger of turning back the clock each time. Everybody, you described it as my personal journey, but whatever journey it was seeking information. And the incoming minister should be confident that we're, especially in the same administration, where the last minister got to is where they pick up.
Yes. Thank you.
Does that help?
That helps in
I've never been asked about the theory of the civil service.
No, I wondered if that might be an answer, or might be your answer. Do you see any downside in there being a handover? Plainly, one of the problems of a handover is somebody's leaving a job because they've just been kicked out of their office, if they're using a vernacular. They may have been moving on to a more senior office themselves, so it may be more complex.
I hesitate to say that the handover should be between minister and minister for the reasons that you've clearly identified, Sir Brian, in that some ministers are leaving government whether they wanted to or not. All ministers are moving on to other departments, normally, which are very busy departments. And therefore, if there is to be some sort of handover, as you describe it, it should be on the basis, I think, of what are the big issues that were sitting on the minister's desk as she or he left the department. And then it would be up to the incoming minister whether they wanted to continue that or not, and they would be accountable for it.
Yeah. The other thing which I want to ask you about is what you were talking to Council about just before lunch, and it's to go to your witness statement. If we can have that back up, please, WITN 5494001, and go to page 114. You've been talking just before this about the question of institutional inertia and the question of a public inquiry, and you went through the various problems there might be in a department itself subject to criticism, calling for a public inquiry into itself. It may be left then to the minister to decide, but the minister, I think, is just. Can you just confirm to me that paragraph 5.24, you say this in the third sentence: it was certainly not ideal to be expected to make the judgment on whether to have a public inquiry into historical events, as the minister for the department said to have been most involved in the past. There is a, you're not a lawyer, but you know the phrase natural justice. Mm-hmm. In legal terms, part of the two planks of natural justice are that nobody should be a judge in their own case. And the second, of course, is listening to both sides. But that nobody should be a judge in their own case, this is the position in which a minister is put if they have to decide on having an inquiry, because constitutionally they would be responsible for their department, even though they weren't necessarily the minister at the time that the events in question occurred.
I can see that point exactly, Sir Brian. It wouldn't have been up to me as a Minister of State to have said, right, we're going to have a public inquiry. I would have had to have recommended it on the grounds that I could have put together. I didn't think this at the time, so forgive me, but I do think it, with the benefit of hindsight, that how many times I wish I had hindsight at the time, is that admitting mistakes is a very hard thing to do, and particularly in something as sensitive as healthcare. And it's always been a challenge. And if enough question marks had been raised over the explanation, justification that the Department of Health had been given about how it satisfied itself. So, for instance, Liz Woodison said in answer to the patient Wilson episode, I don't know, she had employed a huge number of staff over 2 years to look at every single document, and I think the other point was, and lawyers had crawled over, I'm not sure she used that word, forgive me, had been all through the evidence and this question of liability. I just think now, rather than leaving it with a minister in the department concerned, even if it had been referred to the Cabinet Office to independently look at it, a separate consideration. Sometimes a public inquiry will be absolutely clear-cut, and I know there are many who rightly believe this is an example of that, but it was complex at the time, and therefore I think the point you make and needs consideration, is it, I don't know, 2005 Public Inquiry Act or something, needs to look at the mechanism, because ultimately I think it's the Prime Minister who decides, it moves up the chain, but I think a separate, independent in some ways, saying, you know what, we think there's enough question marks here, we should go for a public inquiry. And that's difficult if it's the department that's being investigated.
It's not unknown for independent bodies or individuals to recommend to government what they might or might not do. The public administration is perhaps replete with such bodies that are set up just to do just that, in part to take away from the machinery of government the subject issue of the recommendation, and so that government itself can then consider whether to accept the recommendation or not, which has to be ultimately its decision. It is, after all, the government which will have to fund and bear the consequences of any inquiry, in this case, such as there is. So, so far, the reason I'm asking you these questions is that there have been two suggestions made in the course of this inquiry about what is seen by many in the evidence that they've given me as a problem, which is the question of how do you know when there should be a public inquiry or not? One is to establish some form of criteria. That might be difficult given the wide range of issues which an inquiry might encompass. It might not be, but that's one possible solution if a solution is needed. Another is the one which you're suggesting, some independent third party or body or person. So can I be clear what your suggestion might encompass? Would it be something like the Office of the Independent Advisor on Inquiries, or how would it work?
Actually, I don't know, Sir Brian. For example, it could go to perhaps the Cabinet Office, which would have an investigative team that would look at the evidence. The problem is the vast amount of evidence, and so presumably the getting over the line for a public inquiry should not be satisfying completely that there should be enough doubt that there should be a public inquiry, or, and I think I might get this wrong, so didn't the Labour government refer before it did go to a full inquiry, forgive me if I get this wrong, was it Deep Cut or the inquiry into behaviour? It had an interim, did it out of sequence, said, is there grounds to consider a public inquiry? And the answer came back yes, and so the public inquiry was called. So I hadn't really focused on exactly the mechanism for today, because but what I do recognise is the point that you absolutely rightly made, which in the end I felt, which is somebody needs to be checking, if you like, what I'm doing. Am I doing it right as the minister? Or needs to be checking that what my officials are saying to the minister is the most up-to-date and current information as to why the government's pursuing that action. Whereas I felt that the justifications cascaded down through time, and as the record shows, there were the judicial review on Ireland, for example, or the ruling of the judge in one of the litigations actually showed something different. So I don't think I can really help you here, Sir Brian, much more than to say there are ways to do it, and it could be done on an ad hoc basis. There is a need, therefore it is established for a quick independent assessment of whether there are more question marks now than there were originally.
And presumably whether those question marks are such that it might be appropriate to have an inquiry. I mean, there are some issues which government may be quite clear don't need any independent assessment. There should be an inquiry.
Absolutely.
But there are others, perhaps, which are where the circumstances are such that there is a degree of public disquiet, so it seems, about what has happened, and that needs to be answered in some definitive way, and it's not satisfactory necessarily that the department in the firing line should be asked to supply the answers.
Indeed, so I wouldn't see this as a regular mechanism. It would be in the circumstances of a continued challenge to the policy, with clearly questions being raised that are of substance, that don't appear to, I'm not saying it's in this case like you asked me, I'm talking in theory now, totally
I'm trying to take it out of this case, and because it's a general proposition that you're
It is, and I was very nervous of that, because it's that's not my role to suggest to you what you should do, Sir Brian, even though ministers can be bossy. It's ex-ministers. It just, that central proposition that you put to me, which was I was wholly reliant on information from the very department that felt it hadn't acted negligently or had a liability, and therefore the public inquiry route. I think the separate question about finance, whether proper payments, proper support was in place for the infected and affected, doesn't necessarily have to be linked to a public inquiry, but they normally are.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if any questions arise out of that either for you or for Mr. Moss.
No, not from Mr. Moss and not from me.
Okay, I hope that's helpful. I'm sorry, that really was theory of government without any preparation, but...
No, well, you are the person with experience of being a minister, which is why, and you're here, and you raised the issue, that's why I asked you.
Yes, I would go for a quick review by Cabinet Office or independent when necessary.
Thank you.
Baroness Primarolo, is there anything further you wanted to add?
No, I think we've covered absolutely everything. I hope it's been of some assistance.
Well, it has. I'd like to thank you very much for the way in which you've assisted us. You've been very careful to give your answers circumscribed to the questions and the experience which you had, and rightly or wrongly refrained from being too general about it. But so thank you for that evidence and for telling us or describing what I labelled your personal journey in the office, leaving it rather hanging when the brief came in and you hadn't got a chance to deal with it in June of 2009, but there we are.
Yes, I regret that,
But thank you.
Thank you.
So that obviously concludes matters for today. On Monday, we begin 5 days of evidence hearing again from those infected and affected. On Monday, we'll be hearing from 7 witnesses, and the focus of the evidence on Monday is the experiences of the Skipton Fund for those infected and affected with missing medical records.
So, Skipton Fund, missing medical records on Monday, hearing from those infected and affected in a panel.
Yes.
Very well. 10 o'clock, Monday.